Just wait for a minute or two. Hi, good evening, everyone. Good evening from Los Angeles. Welcome to panel 4 of the webinar series, Historicizing Disaster Risk Management, the Ecology of Mount Isarog and its Environs. I am Stephen Acabado, Associate Professor of Anthropology and the Director of the Center for Southeast Asian Studies at UCLA. Before we start, I would like to recognize that as a land-grant institution, the Center for Southeast Asian Studies at UCLA acknowledges the Gabrielino Tongva peoples as the traditional land caretakers of Tovangar, the Los Angeles Basin, and Southern Channel Islands. This webinar series is a product of collaboration among various institutions, including the Partido State University, the Polytechnic University of the Philippines, the Center for Taiwan, Philippines Indigenous Knowledge, Local Knowledge, and Sustainable Studies, or CITIPILS, at the National Chenji University, Taiwan, and the Program for Early Modern Southeast Asia, or PEMSEA, which is a partnership among the University of Hawaii Manoa Center for Southeast Asian Studies, Department of Anthropology, University of Washington, and the UCLA Center for Southeast Asian Studies. PEMSEA is supported by a generous grant from the Henry Luce Foundation and various UCLA units. This series is supported by the Philippine Commission on Higher Education, the UCLA Cochin Institute of Archaeology, and the UCLA Center for Medieval and Renaissance Studies. I would like to thank the panelists and the moderator for their generosity. I know they're all busy, but they have agreed to share their time to participate in this panel that focuses on environmental change and urbanization during the early modern period in Southeast Asia. I would like to play a video to introduce our panelist and moderator. Let's see if I can. Trying to figure out where my, there it is, share screen. Whiteboard, why is it? Sorry. There it is.
The fourth panel is composed of 4 panelists and 1 moderator from the Philippines, Germany, Australia, and the United States. The first member of the panel is Dr. Roland Fletcher from the University of Sydney in Australia. Over the past 30 years, Dr. Roland Fletcher have developed a global and interdisciplinary perspective in archaeology that integrates research, teaching, and service. His fields of expertise are the theory and philosophy of archaeology, the study of settlement growth and decline, and the analysis of large-scale cultural phenomena over time. In 1995, Dr. Fletcher published The Limits of Settlement Growth, a theoretical outline and analysis of the past 15,000 years of settlement growth and decline, with Cambridge University Press. He also has an international reputation as a radical theorist and as the instigator of the Greater Angkor Project, which derives from his theoretical work and is a part of a major research program in Cambodia. Our second panelist is Dr. Patrick Roberts from the Max Planck Institute at Vienna, Germany. Dr. Patrick Roberts is a W2 research group leader at the Max Planck Institute for the Science of Human History, Jena, Germany. His research applies multidisciplinary approaches to explore the past interactions of our species with forest environments across the tropics, from Africa to Southeast Asia, and from the first evolution and dispersals in the Pleistocene to the development of urbanism and later arrival of European colonial powers in the late Holocene. He has authored over 60 peer-reviewed scientific papers and books. Dr. Patrick has taken part in UNESCO Conservation Symposia and currently leads the ERC Starting Grant Panthropocene that is investigating the degree to which pre-colonial and colonial impacts on tropical forest influence Earth systems on continental and planetary scales with legacies over the 21st century. Dr. Patrick also hosts affiliations with the University of Queensland and the University of the Philippines and is co-founder of the Pantropical Research Network. Also joining the panel is Dr. Grace Barreto Tesoro of the University of the Philippines. Dr. Grace Barreto Tesoro is a faculty at the Archaeological Studies Program, University of the Philippines. Her research interests include mortuary practices, status, identity, cosmology, and historical archaeology. She is currently the editor of Social Science Dilemma since 2019. She is a member of the Society of Philippine Archaeologists from 1999. Her current projects include the following: investigating values and ethics regarding the dead in past and contemporary societies and the Panthropocene, finding a prehistoric Pantropical Anthropocene, headed by Dr. Patrick Roberts of the Max Planck Institute. She edited the book Exploring Philippine Cemeteries, published in 2016 by University of the Philippines Press. Her most recent book is titled The Ruins of Pinagbayanan, a photo essay on the archaeology of a late 19th century Philippine town, published also by UP Press in April 2021. Our fourth and last panelist is Dr. J. Dupoint-Guedes from the University of California, San Diego. Dr. J. Dupoint-Guedes is an associate professor of anthropology and Scripps Institution of Oceanography at the University of California, San Diego. She is an environmental archaeologist and computational modeler who studies how humans adapted their foraging practices and agricultural strategies to new environments. Dr. Jane earned her PhD at Harvard University in 2013 and carried out a postdoctoral fellowship in Earth Planetary Science, where she developed computation models that charted the spread of agriculture to southwest China and the Tibetan Plateau. She directs the Paleoethnobotany Laboratory at UCSD, where she has analyzed material from a wide variety of contexts across China, Southeast Asia, Harappa, and the Pacific Northwest. She currently directs an NSF-funded interdisciplinary fieldwork project in the Zhuhai National Park, Sichuan Province of China, that uses a combination of computational modeling, ancient climate reconstruction, and geomorphology to chart how humans adapted their lifestyle to the challenging environment of the foothills of the Himalayas. Panel 4 moderator is Dr. Peter V. Leip from the University of Washington. Dr. Peter V. Leip is an archaeologist specializing in the histories of social change in island Southeast Asia, over the last 4,000 years. His research focuses on island landscapes and seascapes, cross-cultural interactions such as trade and warfare, human-environment dynamics, and climate change. He has conducted collaborative fieldworks in Indonesia, Timor-Leste, and the Philippines. He also has an interest in archaeological practice, museums, and heritage management in the Southeast Asia and the US, and has ongoing collaborations with Native American tribes in the Pacific Northwest of the US. Once again, our panel 4 panelist and moderator.
Now I give the floor to Dr. Lake.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Acabado, and welcome everybody. Welcome to our panelists. Good evening or morning or early morning, wherever you are. It's great to have you all here. I'm really excited for this panel. We have a really interesting mix of scholars working on topics relevant to the webinar series, but from different angles. And I think we're going to have a really interesting conversation this evening or today. So to start, I'd like to invite each of our panelists to build on the introduction we just saw in the video and share a little bit about yourself and maybe what you've been doing recently in your research and some projects perhaps that you're working on. So Jade, would you be willing to start the ball rolling on that?
Sure, of course. So I'll go ahead and try and share my screen. Whoops, or close that Zoom box. Okay, can you all see that? Yep. All right. So one of my, one of the current research projects that I'm working on, one of my current excavation projects is in the Jiuzhaigou National Park, which is located in Sichuan province. So this is a Amdo Tibetan area. And this is, so in this collaborative archaeological project with the Jiuzhaigou Valley National Park, part of the question that we've been trying to address is as follows. So this is one of the most, the Jiuzhaigou National Park is located in the Hengdan mountain chain, which is one of the most biodiverse areas on Earth. And believing that that the people who live there, the Amdo Tibetans who live there, might be impacting the biodiversity of this region. They've been the object of resettlement campaigns, both by park authorities and the Chinese government. So traditionally, what people used to do in this area was they would grow barley, buckwheat, beans, and corns on these terraces that you can see here. So this photo in A was taken in 1999. And what has happened since is that they have been resettled away from this area since 2001, and they're no longer allowed to herd their animals in high meadows above the tree line, grow stuff on these terraces, or cut down trees, you know, to use for to gather firewood and things like that. So, you know, a view of before and after of these reforestation, with this reforestation effort that's being carried out in the park. So our collaborative international archaeological research program focuses on one site that's actually located right on these terraces, right about over here. And part of what we've been trying to understand is what has been the long-term human impact in this area. So one of the things that our research has shown is that, well, people have been doing exactly what they do today in this area, and they've been doing so for the past 6,000 years, right down to the types of crops that they grow, the types of animals that they were employing. So, you know, our archaeobotanical research shows that they're doing exactly what people did today: barley, wheat, and flaxseed. And so, you know, really what this can tell us about biodiversity in the region is that humans really had a very integral role, an important role in shaping this biodiversity. So I'll maybe talk a little bit about some of my other research later, but one of the other sort of facets of my research is we've been carrying out field trials of traditional land races of crops called millets, which are arid and heat tolerant, and that, you know, we think of that, you know, are integral to traditional agricultural systems around the world, from Africa to to Southeast Asia, to South Asia and East Asia. And this is just some pictures of my former graduate student, Cedric, carrying out some field trials, and also a collaborator, Peter Burns. So that's all, thanks.
Thank you, Jade. Yeah, I think Jade's perspective on, particularly on food production, is really going to be an important part of our discussion today. So I'm glad to have that perspective. Next, can I call on Grace to introduce yourself and your current work a little bit?
Hi, okay, I would like to share my screen. Okay. All right, good day, everyone. So since I have a different take on environment, and I'll discuss more of this later when I answer some of the questions. Okay, but since the lockdowns began in March 2020, I've been focusing on finishing my backlogs, and I think most of our the faculty or researchers are doing that. So I'm interested in past beliefs and cosmology. So I work on ceramics from burials, and I'm currently writing 2 papers on grave markers. My other concurrent writing tasks are the experiences and challenges of female ASP graduates, and a paper on a pre-16th century agriculture. So my excavations from 2009 until the present have renewed my interest in settlement archaeology. But whether I'm analyzing ceramics or studying settlements, a constant for me is wanting to know what persisted and how to identify the indigenous in the colonial landscape. So for today's discussion, I will be drawing from these 3 articles that you can see on the screen. One I co-authored with Dr. Buboy Acabado, and some of the archaeological work I did in Manila. So that's it. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Grace. Wonderful to have someone focused on landscapes and the colonial aspects, as well as the symbolic aspects. I think are a very important part of this conversation as well. So glad to have you. Next up, I'd like to call on Patrick to introduce himself and his work a little bit.
Hey, great, thanks. Yeah, it's a real honor to be part of such a wonderful panel. So thank you so much for the invitation. I thought I would just start off by talking a little bit about our current ERC project called Panthropocene, and the basic idea behind, which is also, it involves Grace and Stephen as well, but the basic idea behind this project is that tropical forests today are one of the key parts of what this term is sort of become known as the Anthropocene, or the period in which humans are having a kind of dominating impact on Earth systems. And this is due to various reasons, but they're actually one of the 3rd biggest sort of collective source of carbon emissions in terms of deforestation in tropical forests across the planet. They're home to an immense wealth of biodiversity, which means that any changes in those ecologies actually echoes around the world. And they're also responsible to a significant amount of terrestrial rainfall, which means that if we remove them, we also change the climate as well. And so, although in the past these environments have often been considered kind of green deserts, multidisciplinary approaches are increasingly revealing that actually under the canopy there are really kind of extensive landscapes of human occupation, food production, and even urbanism in the past. And so this project, the idea is to kind of look at, well, when might the origins of this have been, and to look at some major transitions in human impacts in the tropics, and when they might have set off Earth systems changes, with a particular focus on the kind of former bounds of the Spanish Empire across the neotropics, but especially the Philippines. And so looking at how different land use in the Philippines, from the introduction of rice agriculture, the introduction of various domesticated animals, through to the arrival of colonial powers, as well as indigenous resistance, how that has interacted with tropical forests in this part of the world, and how that may in turn have set off things like deforestation, and climate change to different extents as well. So looking at these time slices from kind of pre-colonial through to the colonial period, and comparing the Philippines also to the situation happening in the Americas as well. So these are some of the methods we're applying, for all the way from archival history work through to paleoenvironmental coring to try and get this kind of idea. The step beyond that is then to try and sort of model land use in the past and the degree to which that might have impacted vegetation cover, using all of this kind of primary data to kind of inform that as best we can. And then finally using those land use models to inform or to feed into existing climate models to see how changes in the past might be or might not be comparable to changes occurring in more recent history. So that's kind of an overview of the project and some of the things we're doing on that.
Wonderful. Thank you, Patrick. Great to have a sort of a global perspective here too. I think that'll be an important part of our conversation as well. So thanks for that introduction. All right, Roland, turning to you, can you briefly summarize your entire career for us? Just a quick introduction.
The main interest I have in this is that I work on settlement dynamics on a global scale. And what's particularly become important to me over the last 10 to 15 years is the relationship between those global settlement patterns and the conditions of the environment in which they operate. This was particularly triggered, as Patrick would particularly know, by the work in Angkor and the evidence of the relationship between severe climate instability and the problem of the termination of Angkor as a major urban center, not an abandoned place, but as a disappeared as an urban center. This has had broader implications worldwide because the key result that came out of the initial work I did on spatial patterning was the significance of occupation density in settlements, and particularly the recognition of the entire class of low density settlement systems prior to the Industrial Revolution. We'd previously thought that low density urbanism particularly was just a characteristic of industrialization, and it's not. What's become of consequence to me is that I'm now particularly concerned with the long-term implication in the archaeological record that while low density urban systems can last for quite a long time, if they break down, they take their entire urban system with them. They take the whole settlement network out, whereas the compact urban systems do not. Compact urban systems are unbelievably robust. You can bash the living daylights out of them and the network still persists. So my concern now is an implication from the past that in general, low density urban systems are fragile in circumstances of severe unstable climate change. And that has some extremely ominous implications, as you would be aware, for the contemporary world we operate in, because a significant portion of our population now lives in giant low density urban settlements, almost all of which are effectively at sea level. And it's that particular concern that's my focus. And I'm very grateful to be invited into this session for that reason. Thank you.
Thank you, Roland. So happy you're here to bring your ideas. And we're going to get into those in the session quite a bit, I think. So I just wanted to remind our audience that we welcome questions. You can type them into the Q&A if you're joining us via Zoom, or in the conversation if you're on Facebook. And our session facilitators, Maddie and Earl, will help get those to me. And I can forward them on to our panelists. So please post your questions whenever you want. And we do have some time at the end of the panel to make sure we get to all the questions, but there may be some along the way that are relevant to the discussion at that point that I'd be happy to pose. So to get things rolling, I perhaps we could talk about this term Anthropocene. And I'm wondering maybe, Patrick, if you wanted to start by your perspectives on the term, and is it relevant to us, and in what ways has there always been an Anthropocene, or is it a new thing? We'd like to hear, and then maybe others can jump in there too.
Sure, yeah, definitely. So, I mean, the Anthropocene is becoming an increasingly kind of in vogue term, particularly in the 21st century, given all the things we're seeing in terms of climate change. But to the extent that there is now a significant geological movement to even classify the Anthropocene as a new official geological epoch, with some debate as to when that might be, but generally focusing on the 20th century and various changes then. And I suppose the question for us as archaeologists is it useful to purely focus on the changes we're having on the planet now? Or can we learn useful things by looking at the roots of this kind of Anthropocene, especially if we take that kind of definition of the Anthropocene as the period in which humans are having a kind of dominating impact on Earth systems, which means that kind of changes in human land use, food production, etc., is influencing and having feedbacks on things like climate, things like the carbon cycle, things like biodiversity, that we've heard from various of the panelists that have deep roots in time, and may be able to teach us things about the degree to which changes today are departing from relationships like that in the past. And just finally, more recently, what I think is quite interesting is that there's been a lot of complaint that use of this term, the Anthropocene, as a kind of catchy buzzword for our research is often hiding a lot of the inequalities behind some of these relationships. So the idea of the Anthropocene being used as a kind of idea that all of humanity is having this impact on Earth systems. But of course, a lot of these major changes are rooted in things like colonialism, imperialism, and actually today then being a sort of lack of desire from perhaps certain nations to recognize that they've had an unequal impact on the situation that we find ourselves in today. So I think that's also an interesting element that we can explore as archaeologists, historians, and paleoecologists, as the degree to which these Earth systems impacts have been imbalanced, and also the degree to which social and political factors have interacted there as well.
Great. Jade, I wonder if you could, do you have any, from I guess a longer term perspective in your study area that you introduced to us, what do you think about this?
Yeah, well, I mean, so one of the things that, that is interesting on the Tibetan plateaus, it on one hand has had this portrayal as being terra nullius, right? Until people show up, it's always described as this place as being too marginal. But, increasing research is really showing that people have been on the Tibetan plateau even before, even prior to the Holocene, actually. So people have always shaped that environment. But I think, the point that Patrick makes, though, is that put in the context of today, it's really important to recognize that people have shaped their environment to various degrees. So in the research area that I'm working on, a lot of the blame for erosion, a lot of the blame for some of the ecological processes that are taking place in this area, like deforestation, erosion, lack of, loss of biodiversity, are being placed on the original inhabitants of the area. But I think that the archaeology shows is that they have actually contributed very little to these processes. They rather, actually probably shaped the biodiversity of this area through what I would call intermediate disturbance, very low levels of tree cutting, light levels of burning, and creation of new habitats. But yet they've been charged with the destruction of biodiversity. And then as a result, their entire lifestyle has been modified. So, just to get back on the note of climate change, likewise, some of the people who are today going to be the most impacted by climate change are also the ones that are being charged with making the biggest differences or the biggest changes in their lifestyle in order to address it, rather than the colonial actors who have shaped these processes addressing it. So in my case, it's one type of colonial actor, right? But around the world, if we were to draw examples from the United States, or I'm sure as many of you are specialists in here, Southeast Asia, it would be a very similar picture.
Grace, do you, that term Anthropocene, how relevant is it to your work? I'm particularly thinking about colonial Philippines and the colonial process, I guess, in the Philippines.
Hi, Peter. Well, so I'm going to cite what the archaeological work I did with others in Manila. And there are only few places in the Manila area that were occupied prior to the 16th century, prior to European arrival. And most of you have been in the Philippines, have been to Intramuros, and that was the Manila of the time. It was the land area is about less than a mile, I think. And so it's very small compared to what is Manila now. But the urban transformation really occurred during the 19th century. And this is connected with the global trade and also the end of the Manila Galleon. And you see many of infrastructures, whether houses or factories that have been built outside Intramuros. So the 19th century, I think, is key to understanding urban transformation, at least in the Manila area. And of course, it intensified after early 20th century when the Americans came in. And you see many of the esteros or canals in Manila were being covered due to hygienic reasons. So the urban transformation during the late Spanish period in the Philippines in the 19th century was connected to following an order, a European order. So there is a difference reason for the urban transformation in 19th century and the early 20th century. In the early 20th century, urban transformation was because of sanitation and hygienic reasons. And when we had a team looking at cemeteries, most of the cemeteries were also created or established during the early Spanish period, or if there were cemeteries that were created or established in the late 19th century, it was also due to sanitation. But until that, many of course, the elites were buried in graveyards. But you can see there's a pattern emerging that most of the transformation was happening in the mid to late 19th century until the 20th century during the colonial period.
So I'm wondering, Roland, I was thinking about your discussion of low density versus high density cities. As a specialist in Angkor, looking at 20th century Manila or 21st century Manila, is Manila doomed? Is it
not at all? No, Manila's really tough. And if any of you want to invest in real estate, go for Mexico City because it won't be affected by sea level rise. Real advantage. But Manila's, though a very demanding place to live, it's actually quite a viable size. It's quite a competitive city in that sense. To follow on the point about Angkor and also the point you made, Jade, one of the things that really struck me when I was in Angkor for the first time is seeing the forest being removed again for the development of agriculture, but noticing how vital and alive that rice agriculture introduced human forest actually is. And that rice fields, for instance, are a massive expansion of the area in which fish live because of the way the rice fields are used. So it was this interesting issue about seeing a new dynamic ecology being actually created by human beings. That's tempted me for some time to an argument that what we should do is actually dump the Holocene and retrodict the Anthropocene to the beginning of agriculture and argue that it's actually agriculture that is the serious impact. But in reality, I think the longer term point, and it's what really worries me from the work I've been doing on large scale settlement change, is that we should in fact keep it to the 19th century, because the extreme transformation has been occurring since then. To give you some idea, if you look at the scale of the beginning of the development of urbanism from about 5,000 years ago, the rates of growth in those settlements were about 5 square K per century. The rates of growth in the industrial world are 5,000 square K per century for the extension of cities, which is why we now live in a world which is dominated, 50% of us live in urban landscapes. So though I'm tempted to get rid of the Holocene, I think it's proper that the Anthropocene should really start from the 19th century.
Interesting, yeah.
I
Okay.
guess to add on to, you know, what Roland was saying, you know, one of the things that the term Anthropocene always strikes me as in archaeology is this tendency to say, well, you know, humans have always modified the landscape, which is their landscape and their environment, which is true, and they've always adapted. And in that, you know, there can be a sort of a couching of this, like, oh, we'll always be okay, and we'll always continue doing things and always find a way to change and adapt. And I think it's very important to realize that we are propelling ourselves out of, even if it was an Anthropocene, the Anthropocene that we previously knew with climate change, and that we might actually not make it out this time as a species, or at least nowhere near the current densities that we live in on Earth, which would be untold suffering. So, you know, it's important to, I think that, you know, as archaeologists, we tend to focus on the adaptations that people have made, but we may well be moving into a scenario where we're well outside of that now. And well, I know we'll talk about that later. But...
And we're moving exceedingly fast on
yes.
a very, very large scale. I think that's one of the key things to convey.
Well, I do want to turn to this. I guess one question we might have a little bit later is, you know, are we in for, could we construct a soft landing for ourselves, or are we headed to some form of disaster? But maybe before we get there, let's talk a little bit more about, I guess, the source of our information, some of the kind of the building blocks of the data. And one question has to do with, I guess, the climate record or the environmental record, and particularly the proxies that we use. I guess a question we have on our list here is, how are our interpretations influenced by the nature of those proxies? And I wonder, Patrick, maybe if you wanted to, I think we all use proxies in various ways. Some of us create them and some of us are just consumers of them, but I think Patrick does a lot on the creation end. You might start that conversation for us.
Sure, yeah. So, I mean, I think this is one of the crucial reasons to have multi and interdisciplinary projects, because each method, of course, has its own benefits and its own drawbacks. When we're talking about these kind of, I guess, human environmental interactions, on the one hand, we obviously certainly need the archaeological data, so things like Jade has mentioned about archaeobotany, zoo archaeology, to look at what were people eating, what were they managing in the landscape around them, but then to get some kind of insight as to what that's then having on the landscape. We then need things like paleoenvironmental coring, whose pros and cons will then change depending on the type of water body or context that you're then performing that coring in. It might have a local signal, it might have a regional signal, and then in those cores themselves, the different methods you apply are going to be easier or harder to try and draw out. Is it climate change that's having an impact, in the past being sort of natural climate change, if you like, or is it humans? And so then we need to use various proxies within those cores themselves to then look at that. Similarly, Roland will obviously know this from Greater Angkor, LiDAR has had this major impact on being able to kind of strip away vegetation and survey massive areas of space, and looking at kind of what kind of impacts humans might have had on the landscape beforehand, but actually then to some extent to work out the ages of those different landscape traces then requires archaeological excavation to come in. So I think, you know, there's a clear need to try and combine all of these methodologies depending on our specific question, to look at these questions. And then also within that, talking about things like social political imbalances, we obviously need things like history, we need things like ethnoarchaeology, and social anthropology, cultural anthropology, as well, to come in, and obviously the work that Grace is doing there is incredibly important, and Stephen as well.
Could I drop in a comment there, Peter, very quickly?
Yes, please.
Just to follow up on what Patrick was saying there, there's a common understanding that interdisciplinarity is making everything fit together. The point I want to emphasize that in many cases, what's really informative is when data from different places and different contexts doesn't mesh. Legal battles in court are commonly about that, what people say as distinct from what's on the video camera. The example in Angkor is that we have a wonderful case from Dan Penny's work, where we have a temple which is formally dated by an inscription to 850 AD, but when you core the massive moat around it, the moat was established by 750 AD. In other words, the really important thing you learn is that the ruler is pulling a fast one on you in some way. He's utilizing something that was already established. And what I think is crucial in many ways in what we do is getting different classes of information and looking at the difference between them to learn something new, as well as the really valuable exercise of putting information together from different fields.
Thank you, Roland. Yeah, I was going to ask, and this actually fits into what you're saying, is the panelists feel like there are particular gaps or things we might be missing based on the proxies that we commonly use. Are we being biased in our understanding of past environments by the things we have access to, I guess? And what do you feel in your own work is, if you could have a magic wand to get a piece of past environment, that's what's missing right now?
Well, I could sort of take that if you want. I mean, part of what's tricky with any proxy is just that they are a proxy, right? They're using some type of analogy to get back at what X or X past condition was. And oftentimes we're using the analogy, right, directly. You know, we're using, say, delta oxygen 18 as like a measure of monsoonal intensity. But then it's this question of, well, what does that really mean, monsoonal intensity? Like, how much more water are we talking? How many more extreme, weather events are we talking? How often is it occurring? Is it like per year? Is this just like an average increase in average precipitation per year, or is this punctuated by more extreme events? Likewise, with so I'll also add that, a lot of the sort of isotopic proxies that we're using are actually just reflecting this moisture equation. But in my case, I'm also interested in proxies like temperature, and those tend to be derived more from biological proxies like pollen or tree rings, or also like chiromanoids and small-shelled beings that live in lakes, right? So it's really getting from this analogy down to something that we could express in a type of model as X millimeters of precipitation, or X amount of annual temperature, and that's something that all of our proxies are plagued by this issue of how do we really translate them into that. One of some of the best proxies that we have in many ways are things like tree rings, but there's often this issue that that record is not going back right to, in many, or at least in very few places of the world, does it go back all the way to the very early Holocene. So it's probably best documented for the past 2,000 years, but then as you start moving back earlier in time, you're getting less and less accuracy based on less and less records, and then sometimes you just don't have anything for a particular area for many thousands of years. So that's always a challenge, is how do we go from this analogy, and how do we get high precision enough data to think about data in the terms that would have affected people, because people do live on a year-to-year basis, or on a seasonal basis, and often we don't have that kind of resolution.
Right, thank you. How about Grace, for you? Can you tell us a bit about, do you use paleoenvironmental proxies in your work at all? And what limits do you find?
Not in my current work or in the papers I presented, the list of articles I presented earlier, but I know colleagues here at the university would look at archaeological materials, and they noticed that they have observed that species of deer and of course species of cladrouts are extinct at and the primary reason that they gave was it's overhunting. So there's a human agency attached to it, but not really climate change. Something that perhaps it can be investigated.
Right. I think, one of the, I see your hand there, Roland. One of the questions for our early modern period project is the time frame is, maybe 500 years, depending on how you determine that period. And our proxies are often at that. They're not at the resolution that gives you any kind of dynamics within that short period. I was curious about for you, Grace, since you work in this later colonial period mostly. Roland, did you have a thought to add?
It's an inversion of a common view, actually. I would argue that we need to move away from population figures as a proxy for what is actually going on. Archaeologists are obsessed with the idea that we've got to get population data for previous cities. I would argue that what we actually need is an intensity of occupation index. In other words, it's occupation densities, not residential densities, that we would study, because then we have complete intercomparability across the whole of the archaeological record and the present. So in effect, the argument would be that what we actually need for the present day is indices of the materiality of modern cities, rather than dropping into population estimates. That the core issue is the impact that the populations have, rather than the number of them. We do have the beginnings of calibrating the effect of human beings in the present, and it's that we should systematize more into the past and much more vigorously, both in terms of settlements, settlement patterns, and the kind of impact on the landscape that someone like Patrick and Jade are already working on. So
how can you give us an example, Roland, of a measure, a proxy for this?
Basically, if you look at low density settlements, the key characteristic of them is that they have lots of space, open space in them proportionate to the number of structures. But obviously, the degree of activity that is going on in the place isn't a simple correlate of how much open space there is. And what in effect we need to do is to do archaeological analysis on modern cities to get appropriate indices for working on past settlements, rather than what we're trying to do at the moment, which is to go from buildings to numbers of people. We have to do it of necessity, and sometimes it's useful. But it's quite a conceptual problem, because we're assuming many things about numbers of people per houses and so on. We can do that quite reasonably in some cases. We can do it fairly consistently in Cambodia, but it's quite a problem elsewhere. So it's a change towards a different kind of index of what's actually going on in settlements. Be a great deal more work, but a lot more work to employ a lot more archaeologists.
Well, job security is always good, right?
Absolutely.
Jay, do you use demographic information in your study area at all?
Not that much, in the sense that it has not been systematically surveyed. There have been, very light surveys that have been focused on either a kind of accidental discovery or survey-based discovery. So we don't, for the Tibetan Plateau, we don't have very accurate coverage, I'd say.
Well, I think that's the advantage, is that if we take what we do as archaeologists and what people do in the present day researching impact, that would be a much more consistent way of comparing the present and the past than to try and go into populations, which is a real desire of archaeologists, and I think actually quite problematic. And we may be wasting our time doing it when it's impact that's actually the issue.
One of the kind of things that can also get really confusing with this is, sometimes when we measure things like population size, we're initially doing this on like house space estimates and like based on ideas for like how many people live in houses and stuff. But in the area that I live in, that I work in, traditionally, Amdo Tibetans practice a form of marriage that is basically Meitri locality. Basically, two brothers will marry the same, two or more brothers will often marry the same woman. So you often have like these larger extended households that are actually deliberately keeping population levels down. But people may interpret these households, and then they also have multi-layers, with one level with where animals are kept, and then another one that humans inhabit. And I could easily see how things like this could be completely misinterpreted in the archaeological record and give very skewed estimates of how many people really live there.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, yeah, we have been battling trying to get demographic information for so long, and it seems like an endless process. So I'm intrigued by the idea of giving up on it and finding some other measure. I wanted to maybe have one more question in this realm before shifting gears a little bit. And this is so let me pose the question, and I'd say anyone who wants to volunteer to take a stab at it, feel free. The question is, how sensitive to changes in climate were different types of strategies that people carried out in the past? So I guess this is kind of like what things are most climate sensitive and most likely to be impacted by external climate change? So
I could take that one if you want. So the answer is this is a really good question, and it really depends. And there tends to be this assumption that climate's changing and it's just affecting people all around the world in the same way, but it's really not. It has the way that the climate changes has very different impacts on different people, and this really has a lot to do with what people do, like what types of crops do they rely on, what type of food are they growing, what is their ecology, and how vulnerable are they to things like sea level rise. One concept that's maybe worth thinking about here is this idea of biome distribution, right? So we're all familiar with biomes like deserts, grasslands, tropical forests, and these are distributions of plants that are created through that occupy specific niches of both temperature and precipitation. And the crops that we've cultivated as humanity do the same. So rice, for instance, is a tropical plant and requires sufficient water, often in the form of paddies. It also requires pretty high temperatures, whereas crops like wheat and barley are relatively frost adapted and can deal with much cooler temperatures. And then on the other hand, you've got things like millets that actually like quite a bit of heat, but are quite arid tolerant. So, just based on that basic information, that that changes in climate are going to differentially impact different areas of the world based on what people are doing. So to give you, I can share my screen quickly and give you just a little example of some of the stuff that we've done on this front, and I'll just move things out the way. So one of the things that we focused on is on, trying to create computational models that actually do speak to us about how exactly changes in climate have impacted where people were able to grow their crops. And one of the places that we were interested in looking at this question was on the Tibetan Plateau. So we're basically, what we presented in this paper was primarily a thermal model. And we were looking at the impact of the 4.2K event on where people were able to grow crops like millets and wheat and barley. And one of the main patterns that we see on the Tibetan Plateau is that millets just completely fall out of the diet and out of the archaeological record in this area following the 4th millennium BP, and you can kind of see why on this figure is that wheat and barley are far more adapted to these cooler temperatures. But the answer is that not everywhere is impacted in the same way. Here is just an example from another paper that's showing probability of being in the thermal niche for rice. And you can tell that, in areas, if we're just looking at like, say, a proxy-like temperature, in areas like Southeast Asia, this was never a problem at all, but this is really going to be something, changes in temperature are really going to heavily impact areas like Northern Asia and like the Tibetan plateau. And, for rice, we do think that, that this cooling event around the 4th millennium BP actually had a real impact. And one of the things that we've argued is that it may have led to the development of temperate varieties of japonica rice in Northern Asia. So just another, quick, so this is some other work that we've done. So another, key way that, another key thing really to think about in Southeast Asia is really going to be this issue of sea level rise. So this was just from some recent work that we did on, well, not so recent actually, work that we did in East Asia, but you can see how much of a sea level rise difference there's been, from the end of the Pleistocene all the way through the early Holocene. And I'll just sort of fast forward to the Holocene here, but this might not look like a massive blip, but at around like between 6,000 to 4,000 years ago, that the area between Shanghai and Shandong there is largely underwater. And this is a place today that probably houses about at least 40 million people, right? So during, periods of time when temperatures were slightly warmer, higher sea level, this, and this is the type of things that we can expect to start experiencing again in the future with rapid climate change. So we should be worried.
And I guess I'd like to, one of the things we're interested in the Panthropocene project is looking at how, I guess, kind of adaptations that Jade is talking about, these long-term adaptations that people are having to different plants and animals and biomes are changing following the arrival of colonialism. Because one of the main changes that happens and has continued to today is that people used to be able to kind of respond to their local environment, right? Whether they're hunter-gatherers, whether they're food producers, whether they're living in a city, they could, see what was happening around them, how their activities may have been changing the landscape. It may have caused eventual problems, and climate change may have ultimately made certain activities unsustainable, but they were sort of free in certain ways, or freer to kind of change their activities or move elsewhere or do different things. Whereas I think one of the main problems we see, particularly around the tropics today, is that the people that are sort of best placed to build more sustainable strategies living with tropical forests, for example, and often particularly indigenous groups that have practiced sustainable agroforestry and things like that over millennia, the hands are sort of tied in a way by global capitalist markets or human-induced climate changes that are sort of changing the environments around them in ways and at speeds, as we've heard, that it's making it more difficult to respond, or alternatively, they're simply just struggling to make a living or to survive. And so that kind of long-running, close human environmental, human ecosystem kind of interaction that used to be there has faced this sort of break, where there are kind of these global pressures that are really mounting on what people can do. So I think that's something that I guess we're going to come on to anyway, but I think that's a major part of looking at how sensitive communities are to climate change and what they can do about it.
Yeah, and to follow up, just quickly on what you were saying, Patrick, I mean, I think that, one of the most fundamental differences between, I guess, the pre-modern worlds, right, and where we are today is really this issue of nation states and borders. Migration has always been a key strategy that people have used. If things start really going downhill, or, sea level rises, you can move somewhere else. But many people today cannot. And even if they could, they're not welcome to by, you know, many people who are complaining about refugees and stuff like that, like our former president. So, you know, we are increasingly locking ourselves, not just in terms of climate change, but also in terms of our social responses to our fellow human beings around the world. And so this real state of rigidity and lack of resilience, we're losing all of the resilience on so many levels that we once had to adapt to severe events of climate change.
Grace, would you like to speak?
I was going to ask Grace to weigh in here, especially about, I guess, I think it's interesting, Jade's comment about where we are now in terms of rigidity and state borders and that kind of thing. It is really a colonial product, or really the main basis of colonialism. What in your work can you say about, I guess, how these landscapes were shaped initially by colonial impacts?
I'd like to pick up on what Jade said regarding social responses. I have a different approach on looking at the human-environmental relationship. And your question regarding the colonial activities that affect this. Of course, in the case of Spanish colonies, it was the decree in 1573, the loss of the Indies, that really changed the landscape of many of the early towns in the Philippines. And it contains, of course, guidelines how to establish towns. And the urban transformation of these villages was, of course, linked to the imposition of colonial power and to provide physical order from the perspective, of course, of the Europeans. The new town would show new space categories during the colonial Philippines. But of course, it was different from the perspective of the indigenous. So what may be a place for the indigenous population was space for the colonists, and there is a reverse sense of order for both parties. And of course, the new colonial town would be associated with positive values such as colonized, orderly, civilized, and of course, everything outside the colonial town would be regarded as savages and disorderly. And in the new town, people would always orient themselves to where the church is, to where the center is. But the indigenous ways of relating to directions or to environment was where the sun was rising. So the silangan, where is the downstream, where is the upstream. And if you go to provinces or in the field works that I've been involved in, you can still hear how the local population or local residents would refer to their physical landscape. So the locals had ties with the environment. They had, of course, cultural, social, filial, religious ties that, of course, the Spanish did not make sense to the Spanish. And in the loss of the Indies, vacant places were used as new settlements, but not all places were vacant, because some of these could be places of ancestral spirits. And we often use a phrase tabi-tabi po to ask permission or to let spirits know that we do not mean harm to them. And therefore, from the indigenous perspective, vacant lots that were utilized by the Spanish to be colonial towns could be or should not have been inhabited in the first place, because perhaps they were for the spirits. The Spanish also mentioned, or the loss of the Indies also mentioned, that the new town should be able to defend itself. But in Southeast Asia, and I'm using a case from the Philippines, the idea of a center is mobile. It's something impermanent. Whereas a colonial town was permanent and it's physical, the center in the mind of the people was, of course, can be moved, and it's where the people are, it's where the community reside. So there is an indigenous warfare strategy called ilihan, and this is utilized during the Spanish period until the present. Okay, this ilihan could be, some people call it a counter center, some people call it a refuge. It can eventually, so people would, the locals, the indigenous population would vacate the center or would leave the center, the Spanish colonial town, and then stay in the Ilihan. And you have many ethnographic and historical accounts of villages being abandoned, or the Spanish were not able to so the Spanish were not able to see the settlers anymore, and they did not know where these people went. But these people went to an Ilihan or something similar. And this Ilihan had its own water source and arable land, and later on could be actually permanent. And the political center was, of course, where the tribunal is. So that is the colonial town also. But in our field works, when you go to the barangay hall, which is the smallest political unit as defined now, you don't see the barangay captain there. The captain is usually holding office in his own house. So you need to know where the captain lives. And if he is not re-elected, then you have a new quote unquote center. So yeah, the center is mobile. So in the new town also, the streets follow the cardinal directions, and we know this, but the indigenous settlements follow coastlines and tributaries. So again, a different sense of order. And which I want to share with you some of the stories that we experienced, or some of the experiences we had in our field work when we were looking for someone to talk to, or for a specific person. One memorable one was we were told to look for the tallest coconut tree when I inquired for the residence of someone. And when I looked into the horizon, all I see were coconut trees. But for these locals, they were able to pinpoint the highest coconut tree. So we need to consider the indigenous perspective of order, or the indigenous way of relating to the environment. So the point I really want to make is to look at cultural ties, because even though colonial activities or the loss of the Indies in this example changed how the land was used, it was accepted, but I think it's still superficial. It had lasting impact on the Filipino psyche, but parallel to it, I think, is the persistence of how Filipinos or indigenous populations viewed their physical landscape.
Peter, could I follow up on the mobility point that Grace made?
Please.
One of the urban systems that's particularly interested me and is very disruptive for archaeological urban theory are the great capitals of Ethiopia, because these were seasonally mobile. The rulers of Ethiopia moved around provinces in their summer season with 30 to 40,000 people with them. So these were moving urban centers. They had all the political structure around the ruler. And one of the reasons for doing this was to prevent the existence of a capital that any outside attacker could sack. It was a method of ensuring the security and stability by actually being mobile. And what it indicates is obviously that you can, as Grace was pointing out, you can get a lot more freedom to move, provided you don't build yourself into big structure. And one of the things that worries me, and it was particularly apparent in Angkor and in the Maya and in Sri Lanka, is that the giant low-density cities of the pre-industrial world commonly built themselves around massive infrastructure. And those massive infrastructures were particularly vulnerable to the specific impact of climate change. And in our contemporary world, for instance, I think somebody remarked a year or two ago that the gigantic underground network system of New York was within 0.5 meter of flooding in the recent high tide levels.
Not to mention Miami.
we face the situation where if you build yourself into massive, stable infrastructures, you make yourself peculiarly vulnerable to severe climate change. It'll pick out the weakness in your system. And it's an interesting issue, for instance, coming back to something that Patrick is familiar with, what all that big land modification in Amazonia is actually doing. and whether that actually had a negative effect on ultimately the stability of using that landscape. There's a big series of issues there about building yourself into big stuff.
I'm curious, back to you, Grace, considering Roland's focus on infrastructure, is there an indigenous infrastructure that your informants would refer to? When they talk about this center being mobile, is there a material aspect to that, or is it purely where the people are?
It's there's no material there in terms of size, because we see this in the historical records that, or the historical accounts written by the Spanish, that the bahay kubo, or the nipa hut, it's basically the same nipa hut, but in terms of the center, in terms of size, it would be of course larger, because the datu, or the richest or rich individual would have a large bahay kubo or large nipa hut to accommodate people. So it's not the materials, but it's not the material, the construction materials, but it's it's in terms of scale. And most of the durable or for more permanent materials, we get that when the Spanish came, so 16th century. And of course, this depends also on the natural hazards or natural disasters that they experienced. So most of the construction started with using light materials, and then fires came, and then they started, there was a decree proposing that, of course, we need to use stone to construct the churches and to construct the public buildings. And then the earthquakes came. There were a series of earthquakes, and there were new ordinances, and it was decided that there should be an arquitectura mestiza, or a mixture of the nipa hut and the stone house. And of course, this decree of the order to use stones in public buildings would create stone industry, stone cutting industries, and many of the volcanic tuff along Pasig River in Manila and further downstream or further inland have been quarried to make houses.
In the area that I work in, we're seeing a similar sort of pattern, just kind of getting back onto this question where, traditionally people lived in this very dispersed settlement pattern. And what's been happening now is they've been put under pressure by park authorities to move into these conglomerated settlements that are situated close to roads, often right at the bottom of the valley, actually. So, the area I work in is characterized by this very vertical landscape, kind of like the one behind me, and everybody's being pushed into these valleys. But part of what makes that very risky is that these are the areas that are the most prone to landslides. This is the Himalayas are very tectonically active. And also, to overflooding from rivers and all kinds of processes like that. So, the traditional system where people were spread out across these mountain terraces actually really had a very important role in terms of resilience and in terms of in terms of avoiding these natural geological hazards.
Could I raise a question there?
Can I add?
Sorry.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead, Roland, after you.
Okay, and because it actually is relevant to the Philippines as well. One of the interesting issues is I've raised this problem about infrastructure, huge water management systems, but there is an infrastructure which I've seen in many areas of the world, which appears to work extraordinarily well and is quite stable, and that's terracing. There are entire valleys in Uganda which are terraced from top to bottom. The Kisoro Valley is extremely beautiful, looks remarkably like chunks of the Philippines. Is it in fact that terracing will actually be a stabilizing system, or are they extremely vulnerable to breakdown? I don't know. Clearly the Maya were using them in places like Karakol and so on. It's a very substantial agricultural infrastructure. Is it in fact a workable infrastructure?
I think we should call on Dr. Acabado since he worked on the terraces and he would be the best person to answer that.
Oh boy, you're there. He can jump in. Jade, are the field systems you work with, are those terraced, or are they just naturally?
Those are natural terraces where I work. However, I have worked on rice farming in other parts of China that are terraced. And those terraces have been around for a long time and are really, I mean, they're just expertly constructed to both retain moisture, to deliver irrigation to the fields, and do indeed really prevent these erosional processes from taking place. Right. They're also important because they're without often these terraces, and I'll even add that even in the natural terraces, right, that I work on, part of what is also holding them into place is what people do on the terraces. So they're not just doing like a monoculture of wheat on one terrace. They've got trees along the borderline and trees interspersed throughout the terraces, and that's allowing the soil to be held together to prevent things like landslides. So I think that part of what goes along with colonialism and the whole colonial equation, and then moving on into the Green Revolution, is this idea that nature has to be controlled and systematized, and that you just grow one thing in a field. So it's also whether terraces are natural or man-made, it's sort of the ecology of how one deals with what is within that space that can really be important too.
Hi, Peter. Can I add to the colonial aspect?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I mentioned that the loss of the Indies was, of course, from the perspective of the Spanish, and it was a guideline used by the friars to create towns. But of course, these friars were not masons. These were religious individuals. And though they were following the laws of the Indies, they did not know the challenges that tropical climate, or even a country in the tropical region would offer or would give. So we have many records of historical records of towns being transferred because they had to deal with flooding. In the site that we excavated, it was an old town in 120 kilometers south of Manila. So that's in Batangas. People were saying that this old town was transferred 7 kilometers inland. Our archaeological excavations show that it was a new town. It was a reduction. So, and our surveys also showed that most of the old towns were further south or further north across the river. So this was near a river, and the town was transferred according to the locals and according to records that because of flooding. But in the two houses that we excavated, there was no evidence of flooding at all. But in the church, there were two massive deposits of flooding. So the priest was experiencing flooding, and the locals were, of course, experiencing flooding, but they had different baseline for flooding, because when the priest wanted to transfer the town, he was met with resistance, and the people did not wanted to move the town because first they just moved there, and it was costly to build those stone houses. And geoarchaeological records show that the place where the houses were built in, they were built on sandy deposits, whereas the church, which was just across the road, was built on clay silt. So in one town, people were having different flooding experiences. And even in the current times, people living in north of the town would have little, would say that the flood waters would be very low compared to south of the town. So, and then, so the point I want to make is that, yes, there were colonial, this was a colonial activity, but it was, the locals' perspective was not obviously considered, and they were not aware of the tropical conditions. But even though that this town was a new town, locals still persisted to stay in the village, and they found a way to manage the floods. They've been dredging rivers until today. They've been dredging rivers, or they would build on floors or new construction on top of flood deposits. So they were adapting, or if you can call it, yes, we called it resilience.
I'm just doing a time check-in. We're at 9:20, this is such a fascinating conversation. I hate to even interrupt and interject, but I want to keep us moving along, and also invite our audience to submit questions. We'd love to hear from you, and I know our panelists would love to address any questions you have, so please type those in. Let's, I guess, switch gears a little bit, but I think just picking up on a lot of themes he's already mentioned and diving a little bit deeper. There's a question here that might be relevant to tackle right now. Let's see. So the question is, where do the limits of adaptation lie? How is present climate change challenging those boundaries? And how does our present moment differ from past scenarios? I don't know if, Jade, do you want to try that one first?
Sure. And yeah, absolutely. I mean, so first, I'll go ahead and share my screen. Oops, hang on. Whoa, wait, that's not the right button. I'll share my screen again because I wanted to just point everybody to this paper that was published last year by Xu et al. And I think that, this figure alone is kind of pretty revealing of several things. So, this is mean temperature experienced by human beings, and different mean annual temperature, right, experienced by human beings over these periods. And this is kind of where projections are in 2070. So we're just propelling ourselves so far outside of what we've previously known. So, when I mentioned all of the different crops that people have adapted to, I'll just sort of go quickly, to another slide. They've all got different requirements in terms of their growth. But one of the things that you would probably notice about most of these crops, and I don't have this here on the slide, is that the sort of upper temperature limit of adaptation for most crops, like the point at which crops really start dying, is about somewhere like 45 degrees Celsius. If you start getting temperatures in above 45 degrees Celsius, particularly at the time when crops are heading or producing flowers, you're probably going to have no production for an entire season. And this really worries me because, well, of what we've just seen happening around the world over the past couple of weeks. So, I think it was less than a month ago, we saw temperatures of, what was it, 48 degrees Celsius in Sicily. If that happened at the wrong time, right at the time of heading, entire crops would have been completely wiped out. One of the most alarming things for me from the recent IPCC report, and I'm just going to share something from the recent IPCC report here, is that it makes it very clear that these extreme events are made much more likely by climate change, and they will continue to occur with every ton of carbon, with every ton of CO2 that we keep pumping into the atmosphere. So, by the IPCC's report, if we're at 1, degree Celsius above the sort of reference period, these 10-year events are just going to become so much increasingly more likely, as will these 50-year events. And, this is only taking us up to scenarios where we're in a world of plus, increased 4 degrees of global warming, right? And the scenario could be much worse than that. And I'd also, so that's just temperature, right? And how that could damage things like crops. But likewise, extreme events with precipitation, so heavy precipitation over land. We've seen several of these happening, right, where kind of patrikas in Germany, in Switzerland, around the world, we were having this, and then, droughts across these regions as well. So, just to, point you to a couple of events that I, and probably Peter as well, experienced and lived through, was this heat dome in the Pacific Northwest, an area that generally benefits from relatively clement and mild temperature summers. This was due to glacial melt. And, one of the things we saw was not only just like approximately $2 billion worth of damage to US corn alone, just a single crop, but already having a massive impact on ecosystems. So, here's an article that I posted from the New York Times. There was a massive die-off event in the shellfish that inhabit marine and coastal areas here. Probably billions of small bodied shellfish, starfish, and small marine animals died in this event, as well as, to mention also upstream, salmon. Eggs were affected as well. So, this type of event is just going to keep on happening more frequently. And this is going to be the new normal, and it's going to really start having an impact. So all of the previous events that happened over the course of the Holocene really dwarf this. And I should have put a figure up that showed, Holocene temperatures to illustrate this point. I don't think I have that in my slide presentation anywhere, but, a good picture to look up would be the Marcotte. There's a Marcotte paper that's published in Science, and he shows, this traditional hockey stick, right, where we are propelling ourselves in terms of temperatures and global warming is just so far outside of the period of time in which we first domesticated all of the crops and animals on which humanity relies today. And I personally am extremely concerned about how humanity will manage to adapt to that. Stop sharing there.
Patrick, I wondered if you could bring some perspective here, and maybe also outside of Southeast Asia or East Asia in your work. Do you see some limits limits that have been exceeded in either in the archaeological record or what you anticipate might be coming soon?
Yeah, so I mean, to take one example, Roland mentioned the Amazon basin earlier. There was a study recently that showed it's potentially on the verge, or at least parts of it are already potentially becoming a carbon source rather than a carbon sink. And that is truly terrifying. I mean, these are factors that even the IPCC report struggles to factor in, because they are things like traditional, these kind of biomes that have been trapping carbon for a long time and offsetting some of these emissions changes. If they start to switch or they get removed from the system, then the whole scenario gets much, much worse and the pace increases even further. So there are areas like that where there really is a really serious concern for areas like that. And as I mentioned earlier, tropical forests are a key part of that. And what's quite scary is that by 2050, over half of the world's population is going to be living in the tropics, over 2/3 of the world's children, right? So if you think about that and what that means for the future of the planet, we're going to have to come to terms with how we can live with these environments, because it's basically impossible to conceive that people won't be living with them. And so what are, going back to the question of the limits of adaptation, well, how do we get so many people to be able to live with environments that we've often traditionally seen as vulnerable? And part of that has to lie in looking at ways in which people have lived with these environments for millennia in different ways to what we might think of. So things like agroforestry systems, different forms of urbanism that I know Roland can comment on as well. And just to take one example that we recently looked on in Australia, the wet tropics kind of rainforest area. It's interesting because a lot of the things in the tropics follow what Jade has been talking about in terms of indigenous populations being moved out, because the assumption being from a kind of Western colonialist perspective that actually any human is going to have a bad impact on these environments if they're there. Yeah. But that's obviously not true. And so, actually what was found in the wet tropics case is that actually by removing people and removing kind of low level burning, you created a buildup of fuel on the forest floor. Things became much less. They'd been managing, pathways through the forest. They've been managing the forest floor for game. Yeah, exactly. If you remove them, you have all this buildup. And if the climate dries, well, what happens? Well, you get a massive fire. And so there's recognition that actually having people in that forest, despite it being celebrated for all of its natural heritage, its Gondwanan heritage, is actually incredibly beneficial. And I think we see that around the world in various different biomes as well. And so we're going to have to, particularly in the tropics, come to terms with, and it's not just there though, of course, with trying to live with environments and live with forms of land use in this rapidly changing world as well.
Just to comment on that, I wasn't at risk in the Australian bushfires, but I was actually trapped in a town in those areas where those bushfires occurred. And it was just staggering to see the fire moving across the horizon. It was really quite terrifying. But what was really striking was that it took out communications systems and it took out the internet. And that then revealed how unstable our system is, because you had people who needed fuel to get out of the area, but they only had credit cards. And all the petrol stations only had only had systems that worked on cash, because none of the Visa card systems would work. In other words, what we haven't done is we haven't hardened our cultural systems. We need to put much more investment into those kind of small structures in order to ensure that our system works. Because my comment on the question that was asked is our big risk is with the speed of change. If the speed of change hits massive infrastructure, you can't recover massive infrastructure. It's unrecoverable. It becomes a problem in its own right once it's actually damaged. Whereas if you have many smaller systems, then you can deal with the circumstances. That will be my big worry. We have overbuilt ourselves into the exceptionally massive.
Roland, can you give us a sense of, I guess, the limits that were breached with Encore and the dissolution or collapse of Encore compared to the things we're
well, the interesting, sorry, my internet connection's not good.
Another sense of infrastructure fragility, right?
Well, the crucial thing to, sure. The crucial thing to notice about Encore is that its water management system was really profoundly clever. These are people who are moving water over almost zero gradients very effectively in a dual system that managed water supply and flood disposal. So this was really a class act in terms of a method of managing water. The difficulty is that one of the ways they did this was to build enormous reservoirs with banks which are 100 meters thick. And if you get two of those next to each other, what you have between them is a channel through which water can only go in one way. And it cannot alter the banks on either side. And if something goes wrong and an excessive amount of water comes into the system, it's going to go through that space and really damage what is downstream. So it isn't that the Barai broke, it's that the Barai created a circumstance directing water in the landscape in a really dangerous way. So quite often with our big infrastructure, it's not what's within the infrastructure that will necessarily be a problem. It's that that infrastructure gets in the way of other things in the landscape. And that can be really deadly. Or the system itself breaks, as would be the case with the New York Underground. Can you imagine trying to recover the New York Underground from a 3-meter flood? It would just be diabolical. Probably too expensive to do.
Can we, I guess, maybe we can spitball some solutions here as amateur urban planners. We have a question here about how would the concept of agro-urban landscapes inform urban planning today and in the future?
I'd be happy to start off. You know, so outside of where I work on the Tibetan Plateau, one of the other areas that I've worked is the Chengdu Plain, which is in Sichuan province. So it's this low-lying plain that is fed by several different rivers that come off of the Himalayas and crash onto this area. And one of the things that archaeological research has showed us, but also, you know, just what we know today, is that people have always lived in, farmers in this area have always lived in this more dispersed settlement pattern. They have, it's called a linpan system in Chinese, that literally means forest basin is what it means. And basically settlements or houses are situated in very small clusters of maybe like 1 or 2 houses that is in this bamboo grove that has this huge amount of biodiversity, both bamboo and a whole bunch of other fruit trees and other stuff. And then people's fields are sort of spread out around this. So this is a system that's really good for farmers because it allows them to both incredibly intensively attend to their fields. And by the way, they have the Chengdu Plain is, I mean, we're talking about rice farming systems that have the highest, some of the highest production on Earth. And people are, of course, not just growing rice in them, they're growing ducks and carp fish and all other kinds of biodiversity is going on there. There's no loss of soil fertility whatsoever. They're in fact growing in fertility, their soils. And it also is a good system because what this also allows is this allows prevention of flooding from these rivers that are crashing onto the plain from upstream, because every single farmer is responsible for the management of these irrigation systems. And because the irrigation systems are so critical to every single one of them, there's this very high level of management of clearing each of the canals that takes place, that's making sure that they are not getting overwhelmed, and people, you know, just monitoring this on a constant basis. And part of what the Chinese government has been encouraging is, again, you know, the move towards more conglomerated settlements. But part of the question is what are we losing in that movement toward these more conglomerated settlements where people cannot monitor their own backyard, literally, in situation as well, in terms of over flooding and, you know, just treating that. So, I mean, I would say one of the solutions is listen to people about what they've been doing for thousands of years, because people really do understand and know their home. And coming in as an outsider and trying to impose solutions is really rarely a good solution.
What about Grace? I'm wondering if you might comment on, I guess, back to Manila, just because you live there. I mean, the system Jade mentions here sounds like it really is not anything that could work in Manila. You have so many.
Urban, you mean?
Yeah, I mean, I guess, you know, is there a food production system, or what sort of urban planning might help Manila, I guess, be more resilient to the kinds of impacts we know are coming?
When you ask the question regarding agro-urban, the first thing that came to mind were the garden vegetable, the urban gardening that peaked when the pandemic began. So people were starting to, because they were afraid that no food would be coming in from the provinces, and most of the food that, well, all the food that are feeding Manila are coming from either imported or coming from the provinces. And because of the lockdowns, people started to grow their own food, not rice though, but we have vegetables, mostly vegetables. But now in Manila, I think there is a move now to have, well, here in UP, in the garden, Mandy, a colleague, started to have a small garden. So he's planting vegetables for people to consume here. So it hasn't really been taken up or thought of, but should be considered. I know Japan is doing a lot of agro-urban farm. So I think we can learn from that.
Well, when I was a child in the UK, one of the great features of a big city like London was enormous areas of allotments which had been brought in during the war in order for people to grow food. So you can certainly introduce this kind of system even into relatively compact cities. I've just been looking recently at the phenomenon of urbanism, Vietnamese urbanism, the urbanism that's been expanding since the 10th century in that country. And it's very clear that they are using a ruralized urbanism from the 10th century. And when you come to the present day, I think the figure from Hanoi is that 40% of the vegetable produce that is needed is actually grown within the urban area. So it's certainly possible to do those kinds of agricultural activities within an urban landscape. And I think there's some interest globally in trying to do this, isn't there, Patrick? There's some discussion of this in US cities and so on. That's separate from another issue, which is agrourbanism in really dispersed low density cities like the Shanghai complex or the Guangzhou complex, because those are the type of giant low density systems which I think are really at risk now. And the agriculture may work well, but the whole structure and its dependence upon massive infrastructure is what would worry me.
Sir, I just wanted to add something. So when the Spanish came, so they built the Intramuros, the walled city, and outside of it, the Arabales, mostly there were agricultural lands, but I think a wrong sense of space, because the Spanish inculcated this hierarchical space where the center is primary, where the center is civilized, where all the good things happen in the center, and everything outside the center was, of course, negative. And Manila, of course, expanded. And so you have the Arabales, or the suburbs. All the agricultural fields outside Manila were turned into eventually residential areas, particularly during the early 20th century. So you have American businessmen coming in and buying swamps of mud flats, swamps, reclaiming and turning this all into residential areas. And even now we have politicians who are real estate developers buying rice fields and converting it into subdivisions. So, but if we had, perhaps in hindsight, many parts of Manila should have remained as agricultural fields, and residences should have been built elsewhere. Which, yes, I think it's an issue of how we view space, and that's why everything, all the cities, all the businesses should be in one area, wherein you can actually decongest that place. And if people would view outside parts of cities or areas outside Manila and associate them with positive things also, then I think you can decongest these populated areas.
I mean, one thing I've noticed in the pandemic, at least in Seattle, is there has been this fairly significant out-migration from cities by people who had the means to do so, to get away from what they consider dangerous areas. So perhaps there's a model there too that might be interesting to look at. I'm wondering if I mentioned this kind of soft landing idea earlier, but are there things we can learn from the end stage of Angkor, Roland, or maybe other parts of the world, Patrick, that could be model for us, for what's coming? Because
Patrick, do you want to speak first?
Sure. I mean, I guess in one sense, what's interesting is although there's a concern at these systems sort of collapsing, if you like, what, as Roland alluded to earlier, what actually collapses is the political structure, right, primarily, and that actually food producers continue to remain in the majority of these areas, in many cases up until today. And so on the one hand, it's perhaps not them that should necessarily worry, but perhaps, the politicians that should be most concerned about their power persisting, which I think is an interesting perspective on moving forward, and perhaps why we can start to see a scrambling of politicians to try and address these issues now. But I guess obviously still with that collapse of infrastructure, it's not going to be pleasant for anyone. So, there are still issues there. But in terms of that soft landing approach, we can certainly see that systems continue beyond the collapse of perhaps these central areas. You know, Roland can talk about what happens when Cambodia goes, but there are certainly, you know, in Sri Lanka, for example, when those cities fall in the northern area, it moves southwards towards the more, you know, wetter tropical regions. And there's persistence of centers in various places, and perhaps, you know, or in a persistence of food production. And so in those things in mind, perhaps we can start to think about, as I think people are starting to think about, you know, should the worst happen, what can we turn to? What, you know, and one of those key things is looking at food production and how, particularly in the tropics, how can food production be aligned with keeping important tropical forest ecosystems that are crucial to the stability of the landscape? Because if you start to lose all those forests, then that really is when you get to a point where, well, a soft landing is virtually impossible, because you lose the stability, and the climate again changes even further. And also then in terms of, you know, looking at where we should move cities to or design priority cities. Interesting, there was a team from Brazil that contacted us because they're working on modern urban planning, and they show that, you know, where they have natural hazards, particularly in terms of flooding, on slopes in certain cities where there's a reserve or where there's forest left, those slopes are much less effective and so affected. And so the populations living in those areas are much better protected from what happens there. And so there's small things as well within existing cities that can be done, sort of where, as Grace sort of mentioned as well, where do you build your new buildings, right, with the hindsight that we now have. And so I think there are sort of smaller things we can do in terms of looking at our food production going forward, where we're going to build going forward. But obviously, if major upheaval happens, then we have to think about what happens there as well.
Just to follow on from what Patrick was saying, there's a really interesting phenomenon. If you look at the Maya world, the breakdown of the classic Maya, the breakdown of the northern Buddhist cities in Sri Lanka, and the breakdown of the Angkorean system, you get an interesting contrast. In the Maya world, the ruler system vanishes completely. In the Sri Lankan world, it breaks apart into much smaller units. What is really striking in Cambodia is that this giant city fades away, doesn't work anymore, but there has never been a break in the socio-political structure of Cambodia. The rulers moved sideways. They did basically what the Romans did. They shifted down to the Phnom Penh area, and the socio-political integrity of that core of the Cambodian state persisted, and has persisted through to the present, continuing, for instance, to use Angkor Wat, the main temple, as a sacred location. And I think the clue here is that what we're now beginning to find, particularly from work that Miriam Stark is doing, that there are many subsidiary locations in the Angkorean world. And what the rulers did was they moved to one of those options. What this suggests is that the thing we need to watch with these giant low density cities is that when they break and they take out the heartland of the urban world, which would, for instance, be the whole of the east coast of China, if you have workable places to which people can move and the power structure can move, your system can remain operating. In other words, the implication would be that we should be reinforcing, for instance, in the United States, the middle American cities. They're quite well endowed places already. You know, some of them have symphony orchestras and the like. They've got quite a lot of cultural infrastructure. If we're going to face the breakdown of something like the East Coast megalopolis, what we need is places like Atlanta, where the population will move. And the big issue is whether a place like China has systems that they can use for that. There are big inland cities like Kaifeng that power and social management could actually shift to. So that may be one of the adaptations that we should get into. I've been in a couple of discussions about this previously, of creating a much more distributed, much wealthier, smaller urban system, because that will be the survival mechanism for our societies. And that may be a crucial feature of the world that we're living in. So we have to manage the ecology on the one hand, and we have to manage options for humans to move into, but we've got to get those set up already. And that's one of the crucial issues that we face. That's me being optimistic. That's very surprising. Yeah.
That sounds easy.
On the optimism note, I'd also, like to say that there's nothing inevitable about the climate crisis. Yes, we do have, we are in this zone where it's going to take us a very long time, possibly thousands of years, to undo what we have done till now, but we can certainly stop it getting very bad. And we can do that by really dismantling the system in which we live today. And we do actually have the power to do that. It's easy to fall into an area where this seems inevitable and that there's nothing that we can do about it. But those of us, particularly those of us located in places like the United States or, Europe, or Canada, or even, Australia, actually, we are the biggest contributors to carbon emissions around the world. And we and the systems that we have put into place, the capitalist, colonialist systems that we have put into place, are the very ones that are causing this current moment of climate change, and we can dismantle them. We have the power to do that. We can start by gutting the fossil fuel industry. We can even start by doing things like attending webinars like this versus flying around the globe. There are recent studies that it's 1% of less than 1% of the world's population that create a substantial portion of global carbon emissions just through the act of flying, like so many of us academics do. And I think it's, we've reached an inflection point, and I think it's time that all of us just really take a stand and ask the question of how can we dismantle these systems, both politically, both in, returning power to indigenous holders of knowledge, but also in really trying to have some type of accountability in our own lives about how we seek change, and we can demand change, and we should at every single possible level.
By persuading my government.
Yeah, and mine.
Well, we are almost at the end of our time, and I wanted to first of all thank the wonderful panelists today for really, really stimulating conversation and lots of things to chew on and think about. I wanted to give each of you a chance, if there's something you wanted to say and hadn't had a chance to say it yet, please do so. And otherwise, we're going to be wrapping this up. So does anyone have any final remarks or comments?
Okay, fine. On things you can do, I would really like to point out that, I mentioned disrupting the fossil fuel industry. It's really critical that we stop them from expanding. They are currently expanding quite massively across the United States. There's a movement to stop things like Line 3, which would be a new line pipeline. When you can, get involved in support initiatives like that as far as possible. Those are some of the most consequential things that you can really do to stop this from getting worse, and we can do it.
Thank you, Jade. And Jade's been pushing us to make our American Archaeology Conference online. Great initiative, I support. So maybe we can at least start there. Grace?
Yeah, I would like to end by sharing what I wrote for the editor's notes of the June 2020 Social Science Diliman Journal issue. So I quote, as legal custodians, we become responsible for the environment. Zoonotic diseases such as the current COVID-19 pandemic reminds humanity of our fragile relationship with the environment, where we find ourselves at the losing end. It is therefore the responsibility of everyone to care for the natural environment, for it is everyone's right to live in a clean and safe world. Thank you.
Thank you, Grace. Wonderful. Patrick, any final words?
I don't think I can add to that. I think that's a perfect ending. Just to say that it's been an honor to be part of the panel and to be invited to speak with everyone. And yeah, it's such a great group of people, and it's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Indeed, thank you. And mine last comment is completely incidental in one sense. It's directed to Jade. Do you know about a crop called teff?
Absolutely.
Super stuff.
Yeah.
Almost invulnerable to anything as far as I can judge. A really interesting crop. This is a crop that grows in Ethiopia, a grain crop. Really interesting. I recommend it to you as something to look into.
Yep, African
Not you,
millets around
Jade,
the
but
world
everybody else.
Millets around the world are amazing.
Yeah, indeed. And thank you very much. Thank you, Stephen. Thank you for all your team.
Thank you so much for organizing this.
Thank you, everyone. I actually have to hop off. I thought I still have an extra hour for a keynote speech that I'm supposed to deliver in the conference. Apparently, it's at 1 p.m. Manila time. I have 4 minutes remaining, but thank you. The IPCC report is really grim, but as Jade and everyone has suggested, if a lot of us start cutting our carbon footprints, we might still be able to prepare a better future, a better climate for our children and our children's children. What this panel has stressed is that humanity responds creatively to stresses, including climate change and disasters, but these creative responses are probably limited to changes that are predictable. With the current global warming, we're not equipped to respond to the unpredictability of these stressors. So we need more interdisciplinary archaeological work that will help us understand the past, to help us address the present, and prepare us for the future. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And
Thank
I'll leave
you.
Maddie. Maddie will take over.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us on panel 4. Thank you to Dr. Leap for moderating and also the 4 panelists for contributing their expertise and knowledge. We hope everyone listening online has enjoyed the discussion, and we encourage you to follow each panelist's research on these topics. As a reminder, this panel, as well as panels 1, 2, and 3, have been recorded and can be accessed on Facebook via the Museo de Isarog page or at our YouTube page called UCLA Program for Early Modern Southeast Asia. We also invite you to visit those web pages for additional resources and events about early modern Southeast Asia. Lastly, we invite you to complete our short survey for an e-certificate at the link posted on the chat or as posted on the screen here. There is no panel next week, but please join us in 2 weeks' time for panel 5, Environmental and Economic History, September 6, 8 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, or September 7, 11 a.m. in Philippines time. The link to that to register has also been posted on the chat. Once again, thank you so much for everyone being able to come out here tonight virtually, and have a good time. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Everyone.
Gotta go.
Bye. Bye.
Cheers,
See you
Patrick.
soon.
Jade,
Bye.
Grace. See you,
Bye.
Peter. See you
Bye,
again.
Roland. See you later.
Cheers.